Due to the additional setup required to include our guests on this episode, you might notice a slight difference in audio quality. We appreciate your understanding and hope you enjoyed the insightful discussion, despite this change.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show that's tabletop games, the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever and join us as we take a deep dive into the bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and fine print of the games you know, or maybe you've never heard of. I'm your host, Troy. Joining me today is my co-host, Max, and our special guest, Darren. Working behind the scenes, as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about Call of Cthulhu, the second edition. This is the beginning of horror gaming and perhaps the first example of a literary genre directly represented through roleplay.
So yeah, this game comes to us in the form of a boxed game, which is typical of the era. And this box includes an introductory pamphlet, a main rule book, a world map, a 1920s era, I should say, source book, and character sheets, as well as some little nice cutout standees for both your investigators and monsters. So this product was produced by Chaosium Games in 1981 or 2 abouts, and the reason we've jumped to second edition on this is because the edition previous to this was a looser sort of game, and second edition is kind of where it all comes together as a product. So we're really not losing much by jumping one edition over. There was a lot of errata in the first edition, and that all kind of congeals into the second. So a little history about Chaosium Games, or very brief, I suppose. So it's founded by Greg Stafford, creator of Glorantha, which is the primary setting of RuneQuest, and Call of Cthulhu is the fourth game. Before this, you had RuneQuest, then Stormbringer, and an adaptation of Thieves' World. And Call of Cthulhu was, I believe the license was originally taken for a different game that they had gotten permission from Arkham Press, who owns the rights. And that fell through, and the designer Sandy Peterson, famous for working on a lot of projects, including being a level designer for Doom, the first-person shooter, kind of insisted that the game be made into, I guess, a more true-to-form version of what Call of Cthulhu would be. As I understand from interviews that I've heard, he originally envisioned the game to be a contemporary setting, but they were worried about how that would sell, so they decided to make it contemporary with Lovecraft. So that's why the game is set in the 1920s. It wasn't his initial concept. And the only other thing to say about this game and its materials is it really raised the bar and maybe even established the concept of player handouts as we understand them. So this is like a document that, it's like a physical thing, like the letter of some relative that acts as the hook for the adventure is actually a letter that you hand out to people and then they can read it. Or it's a map or anything. And things like this had obviously already existed in games, but this game formalizes that idea. The Yog-Sothoth scenario actually had in the middle stapled sheets that you could actually remove from the book and then use as handouts. And they were pretty well produced as far as I understand. So I guess we'll get into the meat of the system, and Troy or Darren, you can kind of help us through this.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at the system from the top, because this is a game about Lovecraft. So knowing that fiction, having that understanding, if you are the keeper, or the other term for game master, it's kind of clutch. It's very important. Darren, because you have so much experience running this game as a keeper, can you comment on your knowledge of Lovecraft and how important that is to running this game successfully?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely need to have your head wrapped around cosmic horror, especially just as a genre. But you have to read at least 2 or 3 craft stories, I think, to be able to run the game efficiently and just to be able to communicate those themes to players who might not be as familiar with the source material. I think at this point, cosmic horror has become such a kind of large genre, subgenre within horror. I think a lot of people who may not be directly familiar with Lovecraft, but have seen movies like Alien or,
Yeah.
you know, The Thing, would still be able to kind of get into the themes of the game and to be able to run it and play it.
Yeah, for sure.
I find that as someone who's not read Lovecraft, I can really still engage with the cosmic horror aspects. And it's almost refreshing because I don't know what the subject is that I'm engaging with. So there's still a very novel aspect to the creatures and setting, as it were.
It's kind of funny because a big concept of cosmic horror is sort of the unknown. So it's almost a double edge there, where knowing less might actually help the players. Because if you've read a whole bunch of, if you've read too much left and you're playing a game, you might go, oh, you're in a graveyard and you hear something howl. Oh, it's ghouls. We got ghouls rolling up on us.
I think for keepers, it makes a lot of sense to read at least a couple. I think even in the introduction, they mentioned that's a valued thing to do. But you're right, for like players, that might be a double-edged kind of thing.
I think as long as you're familiar with the core concepts and maybe have read one or two of his shorter and more basic stories, you'd probably have a leg up for sure. It's funny because I think in the Beyond the Mountains of Madness campaign, you find a journal as a handout within the campaign, and it's essentially a summarized version of the novella at the Mountains of Madness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Because it is a sequel to it. So yeah, I could see how and it's funny because in the history of Call of Cthulhu as a game, a lot of the scenarios are actually just sequelized or prequelized adaptations of stories. Mm-hmm. Like, what is it? Shadow over Innsmouth becomes Return to Innsmouth. And it kind of follows in the footsteps of the initial story, which is one character. And then it turns the entire town into a bit of an insane investigation where you try not to get found by fish people. So to kind of get to an interesting quirk of this game that Darren and I were investigating before we started recording. So the box set comes with, and this will seem strange, but it uses a D100 system, which today we would understand as being 2 D10s, and one of them is denoted as being the tens digit, and the other one is the numerator's digit. And you roll percentile under whatever target skill you're using. There's also other ways to use it, but that's the primary way of determining success. And then it comes with a D8 and a D6. But in this case, we found out that the same year this game came out, the D10 was invented. And so this game comes with 2 D20s, which you use as D10s. And almost in the same way that you do with a D6 and a D3, where you take the value and you essentially repeat the numbers. So once you get to 11, that's just 1 again. How do you think that would feel to actually, like, how much of a headache do you feel that would be? Maybe because you use D10s, then so. Yeah,
I think just coming from the experience of just rolling a normal D100, it might be a little weird. But I think once you get used to it, it's like rolling a D6. There's a lot of 1D3 rolls in Cthulhu, and you don't find that much in other games.
Yeah.
So once you get your head around it, I think it would be too bad. But it's definitely a strange concept.
Yeah, no, I was like, because they even tell you like ways that you can mark the dice so that it's easier to read. But I'm like, oh, yeah, I think you're right. I think after a while, you'd probably just get the hang of it. The character sheet is almost identical in every edition of this game. But like here, I was like, oh, yeah, this is the same basic layout. The newer editions have a backside and other information. But yeah, it's essentially the same.
The mechanics are super close, especially the core mechanics they're just exactly the same.
Yeah, the stats are like all of your initial stats are pretty well identical. Some of the generation of how you determine those, like I noticed that the education stat was a bit of a higher roll because it's 3d6 plus 3. But I can see that the way that education uses is sort of like your generic knowledge check in most cases.
Yeah, and it gives you your base points to spending and skills.
Yeah, so I think that would be the utility of that in certainly a one-shot or a short scenario, which is actually, I just want to make a comment about how the book is written in a very neutral tone, which may give the misconception that the game is very survivable. Because they're like, oh yeah, you're an investigator investigating supernatural horrors. Everything will be fine. It almost doesn't have the hindsight that other editions have, where it's like, yeah, your character may not survive a single scenario.
Yeah, or a single encounter.
It's funny because I don't know that newer editions of the game explicitly say that, but there's some subtext in the way that it's written that is not in this edition. It's very like, oh yeah, this is a normal game.
Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of flavor in it. It's pretty like to the point. It's very to the point.
And how does the sanity score get calculated in this edition? Because I know that's something that changed.
Yeah.
It's directly at this kind of the same thing. In 7th edition, your sanity is equal to your power. And in this, it's equal to your power times 5 because they don't multiply your stats for you.
Right. Oh, that's the difference on the character sheet.
Yeah.
In this, your attributes are between like 6 to 18, kind of almost in that classic Dungeons and Dragons stat range.
Mm-hmm.
But then you would manually multiply them by 5 at each occurrence that you needed to roll under it. Right.
Yeah. So in the rule book, they have the example character sheet, and this character has 9 power. So 9 times 5, 45. So their starting sanity is 45, but it's also their luck score.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. So there, another point is there's no explicit luck score. You're right. It is like a derivative.
You can't spend your luck to make a roll better like you can in the new edition, but it's, I guess, it's the way they talk about it in the rules. They mention if you fall into an oubliette, your players can roll a luck roll. It's probably a pretty rare occurrence that you're rolling a luck roll. I use luck rolls for things like, oh, you're running from a cultist and you're trying to get into a taxi cab, then you roll a luck roll.
Yeah, for sure. That would have been a more, that's a bit more of a grounded example. Do you want to explain for humor's sake? Would you like to explain for humor's sake what an oubliette is?
It is a very, very tiny dungeon cell that they used to use in the Middle Ages as sort of a combo between an incarceration and torture, I guess. And they usually were so small that you couldn't even sit comfortably. It would have you in a very awkward posture, and there was most likely the dead remains of previous prisoners in there, and there's nowhere to go to the bathroom. It's a very, very tiny, cramped space. I don't know what kind of situation you'd be in and walking around 1920s New England and you fall into an oubliette.
That's a little bit specific. But yeah, it's basically the architectural equivalent of being buried alive.
Yeah, pretty much.
So as this is a skill-based game, I think we can get into the point about how those skills are distinguished. So almost, I can't think of many skill-based games that are entirely customized. So this game uses professions as a kind of stopgap for like, who are you? This one has 2 lists. One list in the core rulebook, which has got all your sort of basic sort of investigative ones or like scholars. And then in the 1920s, source book, they have another list that has more era specific. Though it's hard to say because like pro athlete, yeah, that was, I guess, becoming more of a thing in the 1920s.
Yeah.
But that was, you could see that in pretty well. You could find an excuse for that in almost any time period. Few exceptions, I suppose. But yeah, professor, hobo, journalist, politician, parapsychologist. That's pretty niche.
That being my favorite, for sure.
Parapsychologist is a classic. That's a Cthulhu classic for sure.
As much as that sounds like a very niche profession, it is actually very appropriate to this genre. Private eyes, farmers, policemen, soldiers. So yeah, you get a wide mix, and each of those comes with a set of themed specific skills, but there's a lot of overlap between some of these, and I think there's ways to like take on skills that aren't your own, but I think mainly it's pretty specialized to these professions.
Yeah, or at least this is the way you determine like the things that you have gotten good at through your profession.
Yeah, it's like a background basically.
Yeah, 100%.
Who were you before you came to the point where we're doing this game?
Before you were tripping and falling into oubliettes.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, these very specific torture devices. So yeah, skills. So skills are kind of the cornerstone of the game itself, which is, this is basically all the things that you can do. And skill-based games, it's interesting because we think of skills as being associated with role-playing games in a lot of cases. I mean, maybe I do because I grew up in like the 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons era where it became a skill-based game. But actually before this, that wouldn't be that common. But there's some really interesting skills in this. And yeah, Troy, maybe you can kind of get us through some of the really, really like standout skills.
A personal favorite is credit rating, because you just don't see that in any other type of role-playing game. And what credit rating represents is sort of your social status and your purchasing power outside of, spending units of currency to specifically acquire things.
Yes.
And something that Darren has used on us when we try and get into a dilettante ball, then all of a sudden we'll have to roll credit rating to see if we have the social status to fit in, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like how that's just a really interesting element of how the social dynamic of the game is so prevalent. And then to really lean into the horror, you've got Cthulhu mythos. And that's where you specifically actually start to unlock the secrets of the terrors of the universe, effectively.
You start becoming a protagonist in a Lovecraft story. And learn things you can't unlearn. Oh, this is my favorite part of the Cthulhu mythos skill is for every point that you have in the mythos skill, that's one less point to your maximum sanity. So the more you learn about this secret pocket of the universe, the less sane your character becomes.
Or certainly the ceiling starts dropping in on you.
Yeah.
It's how familiar is your character with the goings on and the unknowable forbidden knowledge that exists in the world. And
it's skills that isn't really relevant unless you're playing a long form play, unless you're doing a campaign or something like that. It's not going to really.
Yeah, I know in newer editions, I certainly remember in 5th edition, some professions start with some of that, like I think a cultist does.
Yeah, in 7th edition, you can also take an experience pack.
Right, yeah.
Which alter your character. It'll like drop your starting sanity and it'll increase a skill or two. So it kind of specializes your character a little bit.
Yeah, you've touched the edge of this thing already before play has even begun.
There are also some skills that are later consolidated into different headings. But right now, there's separate entries for treat disease and treat poison, which would later, I guess, just be a medicine.
Yeah, it's being condensed into medicine. You see a lot of that in more modern games, like with Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinders having a perception skill.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's becoming kind of more popular. With treat disease and treat poison, I think is strange because it's very rare that you would be needing to do that, whereas basic medicine kind of comes into play a lot more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Like in this edition, once you reach 0 hit points, you're dead.
Yeah.
There's no dying condition. Yeah. And a lot of RPGs, they have pretty like convoluted dying systems where you're tracking all this information because they want to make it harder to kill you.
Yeah. The closest thing they have to that in this is that if you're 1 or 2 hit points, I believe you're slightly less effective, but not dead. But that's the closest they get. Yeah.
Yeah. In 7th edition, they do have a dying status, but it's very quick. It's basically if someone doesn't perform first aid on you, like within minutes, you die. And if the first aid is successful, you have an hour to get professional medical treatment or you die, basically. Some of my other favorite skills in Cthulhu, and I'm not sure if it's listed as a skill in 2nd edition, but I love how accounting is a skill in Call of Cthulhu.
Oh, it's totally in this one, yeah.
Is it? Okay, that's great, because it's hard for some people who have just played mostly like D&D and other like kind of more generic fantasy games coming into Call of Cthulhu, because they want to build like a fighter. They always want to max out their shooting skills and their brawling skills. And, a guy with glasses who has basic fighting and basic shooting with the accounting skill 75 might actually come in at the end of a sentence and solve the mystery.
Yeah. That really speaks to the theme of the game. I've often, when trying to set people up who haven't played Call of Cthulhu, I usually use the scenario comparison that in D&D, you know where the dungeon is, and you know there's a monster in there, and you're all like, let's go in and get that thing. In Call of Cthulhu, you learn about where the monster is, and then you cement that shit shut.
Yeah, you try to shut it down, and there's a lot of running away involved.
Yes.
Yeah, you don't get directly involved. If the cultists are in the mine, you dynamite the mine and just hope to hell that no one gets out.
Yeah. I always tell my players that you can fight cultists, but it's a hard fight and you can die fighting cultists.
Yes.
But you can never fight Cthulhu.
I don't even think saying successfully is even a good... You can't raise fists, honestly.
Unless you have a steamboat, apparently, but we won't talk about that.
That being the one exception.
But that's always... It takes a few deaths and a few permanent insanity to start learning that they're not heroes and they're just like regular Joes.
My first player death was in Cthulhu, and I just got smoked. It just happened quick. It was fast. It was brutal. And there was nothing that could be done. It was gone before I knew it.
Just
and
insta-kill.
And it didn't feel like I had lost something, but I had gained a story moment.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole draw for me personally, is especially with one shots and scenarios that are meant to be played in one, maybe two sittings, is
Yep.
You don't win by surviving. You win by solving the mystery and or stopping the cultists.
That's right.
But to me, the perfect ending for a Cthulhu one-shot is nobody survives, either physically or mentally.
Yeah.
But the mystery is uncovered and the mystery is solved, and they have, held the tide at bay, at least for the moment. Because one day, Cthulhu is going to come out. If he's going to rise up out of the ocean, you can't stop it. It'll happen.
Yeah.
But maybe it won't happen for another 1,000 years, but there are people out there trying to make it happen tomorrow. And you could maybe stop those people, but you're never going to stop Cthulhu. And that's what makes it cosmic horror. And that's what's so good about it.
So maybe we can jump on to resistance tables, which is a novel concept for... So this whole game works within a system that after RuneQuest became formerly known as basic role-playing. And the resistance table is a staple of BRP. So... Let's, Darren, enlighten us as to the nuances of the resistance table.
Resistance table is actually a pretty unique tool. I was not familiar with anything like it until I picked up the new edition of RuneQuest and I started playing that. But it's a pretty, elegant way to solve how you're rolling against something that's static. If you're trying to force open a door, or you're trying to grapple a person, you have a passive skill and an active skill. And in 7th edition, it's just all handled by opposing rolls. So you just roll the other side instead of rolling one side and consulting the table. But I think it's actually a nice tool, and I might homebrew it into Cthulhu rolls now, because it seems like it's a useful little thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more familiar with 5th and 6th edition Cthulhu. I've only Darren, you've run me through a game in 7th, but we didn't really get into too much of the nitty gritty. But yeah, the resistance table is actually, I think 7th is the only one that doesn't have it. 6th had resistant table, and it had an optional rule for opposed rolls, which I think became the standard.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think the resistance table, it's basically how do you do an opposed roll without the sort of brute force of both of you roll and see who gets higher and passes their skill test. It might seem a little alien to people. I think if you're used to playing, I know that at the same time, or this may have been even one of the inciting elements of this, but I know that TSR was putting out a bunch of games that used similar things. I think their Marvel superheroes games used something like that. They had these color-coded tables that had your ability versus whatever the difficulty of what you're going against. And I know that was a very popular form, but I think this may have been, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. And so I get the sense that this, the resistance table had an effect. But yeah, it is, I agree. I think it's an elegant way of kind of doing an opposed check.
Yeah, I think people might just be, they just don't like tables. They don't want to see, they see a table and they just immediately come to the conclusion that it's like an increasing complexity, but it's almost the opposite. You just roll a dice and refer to the table.
Yeah, it's literally one less dice roll.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't have to, so you're getting into opposing rolls, then you're getting into things like you have to beat it by one level of success. So if you roll a success, then the other person or the NPC has to roll a hard success, and you're getting into all these. It's in a way it's more streamlined. I think just people look at a table and they just automatically see numbers and they think, oh, that's going to bog down gameplay.
I'm not a war gamer. Get that table away from me.
So, but I like it. And another table that I like is the parry table from RuneQuest. And which I find it interesting that they don't have that because parrying seems like in the rules they mention that parrying is like a thing that you want to be doing if you're fighting melee.
Yeah, that's very true, actually.
So it's kind of funny how like there's the resistance table, but then if you're parrying, you're just doing like a normal opposed roll.
Yeah, I know. Like it seems to, even in this version, it kind of prefaces the concept of opposed roll through parry. But yeah, I guess because it's not a combat specific game the way that RuneQuest is.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that explains it, though I agree. I think you could probably just port that over and it would work great. So I guess next we could get into how characters advance, which I thought when I first learned how this happened, coming off of like a level-based system like Dungeons and Dragons, this kind of blew my mind a little bit.
It's a very different concept, and it feels like you're tracking a lot more than you actually are once you start doing it.
So yeah, Troy, if you want to give us kind of the rundown of how that works.
So this is an incremental progression for your skills based on your success with your using those skills. So as you use them on your character sheet, you would check it off to indicate I have successfully used persuasion. When you have significant downtime, you roll against that same stat. And if you can roll over, not past the stat, but roll over it, so it's harder to do the better you are at it, you'll get a 1d6 percentage increase to your stat, to your skill, I should provide. So that 1d6 changes to 1d10 in future editions, but in this edition, it's a 1d6. You just roll it, add it to your percentage, so your persuasion goes up by, 5% if you rolled that, for example.
Yeah, and that standard of a d6 actually holds for a lot of editions. I think it becomes an optional rule in 6th, and then it becomes the D10 in 7th.
Yeah, the D10 in 7th, and it's in the new RuneQuest, it's still 1d6.
Right, yeah. So I've quickly flipped through a sample of the new RuneQuest book. It's surprisingly old school BRP.
It's super old school. I love it. It's pretty crunchy in a lot of areas, but I love the combat.
Oh yeah. We should definitely do RuneQuest because it is a very foundational game, certainly for this company. Like, Stafford was coming up the lore of that, I think even before Dungeons and Dragons had come out.
Yeah, he started writing the lore for Glorantha in the 60s. It's like 66 or something.
Yeah. And I think his only exposure was to like war games up to that point. So
yeah, you can definitely see that influence in the game for sure. But even the name Chaosium is from the Glorantha setting.
Oh, I thought it was because he was next to I think it had to do somewhere with his hometown where there was the Chaos Dome was a stadium, and then it was like Chaos Coliseum, so he merged the words together. But then that ended up in Glorantha.
That's awesome.
And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. You know what? Use what's around you.
Exactly.
Yeah, so let's jump into some of the spot rules, as they're sometimes referred to in BRP. So taking damage, it's not too dissimilar from the way that Dungeons and Dragons handles it, as far as you have a smaller value of die and you roll that and usually add a number to it. As you were saying before, sometimes you would use half the result to make like a D3.
Oh yeah, for unarmed and things like that. That's right.
Yeah, but it's interesting that in this edition, there's pretty much just a D6 and a D8. And the way that damage is based on how health is measured, this edition might be more lethal than other editions that will follow. Because it seems like, yeah, if you roll like a 2d8 with like a gun, you can do this in current editions, but like you could just outright kill somebody like that.
Yeah, it's super lethal. And even relative to what comes after it, it's super lethal.
Yeah, so like that's always been a thing. This game has a short survival rate.
It's like the only game I run where I'm not trying to secretly help people survive behind my screen. I'm like, yeah, kill them.
Yeah, I mean, Peterson even writes in like you shouldn't be adversarial to the players, but you need to think of the NPCs as being like very committed to what they're doing, I think is kind of how he phrases it.
Yeah. If I roll enough damage behind my screen to kill a player, I 9 out of 10 times will just like, sorry, you're dead. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to nerf it. Yeah. So then we have a shock rule, which is essentially if you roll more than half the opponent's total health, you knock them down.
Okay, so that's like a major wound in 7th edition.
Yeah. And then we have a whole list of different combat skills. So Dungeons and Dragons, for example, there are things like proficiencies, but they're all tied to like one combat skill, which is usually tied to level in some way. In this case, you have all of these bespoke fighting skills. So I think firearms is a total group unto itself, but then you'll have like fencing weapons as being a separate group.
Yeah, being good at fencing doesn't make you good at guns, doesn't make you good at unarmed. So they're all separate from each other, and you do have to engage with them. But the fighting system in this is a lot more freeform than you will find in the later editions. At least that's how I interpreted it, where it's just not as formalized. You know, like one is how many dodges are you allowed in one round is not clarified in this. You know, it's up to you and the keeper to decide how reasonable it is for you to dodge all 3 of the cultist stabs, for example.
Yeah, I would hope that someone would use common sense, but I can totally see a situation with a new keeper where they're just like, oh yeah, you basically fly like a ninja through the hall, avoiding all hits. Sorry, you're a librarian?
And you're also Neo from the Matrix? No, in 7th edition, the way I play it is your first dodge is regular success, your second dodge would be a hard success, and your third dodge would be extreme success, which the dodge skill is already a low skill. So to roll an extreme success on a dodge is pretty, like you got to be rolling like a 1 or a 2 probably.
Yeah.
Which is a good way to handle it because it does at least account for having to deal with like sensory overload and avoiding getting hit. So there's impaling. I'm trying to remember how that rule worked in this edition.
If you roll under 20.
Yeah, it's a 1/5 crit. If you roll a 1/5 value critical hit.
Right. And that can be a standard mechanic in other BRP games, but it's interesting in this one that it only applies to certain weapons.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and they handle it in a similar way in 7th edition where impaling weapons, an extreme success on a non-impaling weapon, you just roll damage twice. But if you get an extreme success on an impaling weapon, like a knife or a bullet, then you do max damage plus a second roll. So it's more deadly.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I thought it was weird at first that impale was the term used for ballistic weapons, but I guess that is what it is doing, so makes sense to me.
Yeah, I always took it to mean you're like hitting a critical organ or something.
Yes.
And then, or if you're fighting with a melee weapon, you stab right through them.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So it's like it's more about the end result, I think, is what's being measured.
Just to go back for a second about the dodge, is there a fighting back mechanic in 2nd edition?
I don't think so. I think that there's a dodge. I think it accounts for evading hits, but yeah, there's no counter.
Okay, I didn't see one. I guess the parry would be the equivalent.
Yeah, I think that's about as close, and that more or less just acts as a counter to whatever the attack was to you.
In 7th edition, you can fight back. So if somebody tries to stab you, you can try to stab them. And you sort of get like an action on their turn, but you have to beat their success by 1 level. You have to like roll basically a crit on their regular hit to be able to do it.
Right, yeah. There's like a tiering system that happens. So now we can get into the very unique part of the game, at least the thing that it brought to the table, that now not everyone rips off, but like if you're doing a horror game, sanity. Sanity kind of appears in some of and we haven't covered military role-playing games that existed slightly before this, but there are some like battle conditions for some military RPGs. The titles don't come to mind, but I am looking to do hopefully an episode on covering at least one of these. But they do it in a much more realistic way, whereas in this, it's more, I guess I'd call it literary insanity. I mean, in the sense that it's not how people actually go insane.
Oh, yeah. No, it's definitely not. It's definitely very much a mechanic. It's at the core of it, at least mechanically, aside from another player by permanently, like if their sanity reaches 0, they're permanently insane, is you lose control of your character. So you run into a situation where you see something and you can't handle it and your mind kind of breaks temporarily, and then the keeper gets to control your character for a brief moment.
Yeah, and usually makes you do something pretty wild.
Yeah, that temporary loss of control is very unique to this RPG, because most role-playing games, your character is you're in charge, you're doing what you want. You don't lose any authorship. But with this, the GM can put you in an awkward position that you don't find yourself in often.
Yeah, and did you see anything in the book about like permanent effects? Because I know that later editions touch in like phobias and other maladies.
Yeah, certain things can happen. Like if you go temporarily insane, you have madness, and one of the side effects to a bout of madness, you roll a d10 and there's like a table. And then a potential outcome of your bout of madness could be a new phobia or a new mania.
Yeah, that's much more explicit in later editions. I know that they mention that, and there is a sort of listing of those things, but
yeah, they have a list of phobias, and
yeah, it's pretty fun to look through the various insanities.
But yeah, you're definitely right when you're talking about how this isn't how real mental afflictions affect people. It's sort of that very old, like late 19th century, early 20th century, like ideas of the loony bin.
Hinge of Victorian perspective to it, right?
Yeah.
It's trying to emulate characters in the stories, I think.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's a smart way to do it, because you're trying to create something that's dramatic, and actual rules for like post-traumatic stress disorder might not be that fun. Maybe.
But that's Delta Green.
Yeah, exactly.
You're getting into Delta Green there.
There you go. Yeah. That's that's a different product.
It's funny because there's new house rules that people employ now that I guess are more sensitive to like real life mental health that people like to employ. But it's such a core part of Lovecraft's literature, whereas the character in most of his stories, the character has already gone insane, and the story is their recounting or retelling of how they got there, which I always kind of found to be a bit counterintuitive. This person has gone insane, but they're still sane enough to explain to you in great detail how everything happened.
Right.
Yeah, I often feel that Lovecraft really liked reading The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, because it's basically every one of his stories, well, not all of them, but a lot of his stories basically follow that formula, where like
for sure,
a crazy guy who insists he's not that crazy is going to tell you why he's this crazy.
Yeah. So, and that within the game, that kind of manifests as you are going insane, but you still have the mental prowess to fight through this mystery and pick up clues and investigate. But you're also like a lunatic in the process.
Yeah, that's right. And you actually...
It's like realistically, if you had a real bout of madness, if you had actually had like a nervous breakdown because of a Cthulhu creature you saw, you wouldn't be carrying on your investigation. You'd be like carted away and like sedated by medical people. And the game would be over. Yeah. But these people just like grit their teeth and okay, well, that happened. Let's keep going. Let's go to the library and look up fish.
You still can regain your sanity though. Like you can get it back.
You can by killing things.
Yeah, right. I'll just brush this off for now. I think that's the most counterintuitive part. So yeah, if you get a win over on the bad thing, supposing that's what caused it.
If you're a Ghostbuster.
Yeah. If you bust some ghosts, so to speak, then you can get some, I guess it's kind of like catharsis payback for your sanity.
Exactly. Yeah. It's how you set right the wrongs in a really weird kind of way, I guess.
Yeah. And I buy that a little bit. There's something about that's at least intuitively makes sense. However, the other way, which is institutional rehabilitation, at least I know from my own knowledge of history that's a lot more favorable in this game than it would be in real life, or had been at the time. I don't know that I'd want to be institutionalized in 1920.
No.
Well, I don't know how 2nd edition handles it, but in 7th edition, the way that's handled is like the state asylum. You're actually more likely to incur more sanity damage than get.
Yeah, in this edition, they seem to kind of gloss over. As I said, it is written in a very neutral tone. So they tend to treat psychiatric treatment not that different from normal medical treatment. I think just for the pragmatism of making the game go forward.
Yeah.
So that, like, yeah, if I get really screwed up in the head, I can actually fix that. But you're right. Yeah, the later editions actually account for the fact that psychiatric medicine wasn't exactly at its peak.
Yeah, especially state psychiatric medicine. If you get private treatment in the home is the best way to do it, but you need a high credit rating for that. You need money for that.
And there's that skill coming back.
Right.
I think some other games like Delta Green handle it where if you can sort of submerge yourself in a more mundane setting, you can recover some of it. But that's similar to what you're saying about home care. Yeah.
Yeah, you have relationships. You go home and, have dinner with your wife and ask your kids how their day was. And that kind of helps you, but then it also puts strain on those relationships. I love that mechanic, and I've been figure out a way to bring that into my Cthulhu games because it's really interesting.
Delta Green is honestly like an amazing extension of this game. But we'll get into that at some point, and maybe we'll have you back on for that one.
And now we'll move on to magic and spells. This is a really interesting part of the game because this is almost your high-level play in a certain sense, because you're encouraged to locate and covet mythos books. You want to find, but it's really hard to engage with them in a meaningful way. And do you start to have them, they're actually going to start messing with your overall sanity ceiling like we talked about. But this second edition has a complete listing of the mythos books, what language you need to read them, and some of their impacts. So there's quite a bit to grapple with and grab onto. But these books themselves are kind of only really there if you're going to have a consistent character that has enough downtime to engage with them and learn meaningful spells.
Magic in the Cthulhu mythos is a very, very strange thing to kind of parse, I find, because, you have these unknown cosmic horrors, and there's always this vaguely scientific basis. Like, we might not understand the physics of how Azathoth exists, but it's always framed in that context. And magic, even in the stories, when it is present, it seems more of an extension of some other entity's power, or I'm not sure if I'd want to say like it's science by another means. I don't know if either of you have any input on that.
It kind of is. It is sort of, it reminds me a little bit of like Hermeticism and like Gnosticism and stuff like that. Alchemy, like old school alchemy.
I think it's a better fit in a game like Cult, where the central tension of the horror in that game is essentially a Gnostic mythos. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Cthulhu, it's definitely drawing on that, like you're saying, but it's, I don't know, I always get the sense in any edition of the game where it's like, don't look at it too hard or you're going to make it weird.
Yeah. My favorite part of the game, at least like sort of story narrative wise, is that players in a long form campaign are sort of forced to interact with the same kind of dark things that their enemies are interacting with. So it's like, oh, how do I defeat the acolytes of Azathoth? Well, I have to learn their magic and actively draw from the same source of power that they do to level, because you got to level the playing field.
Right. Yeah. I have some pretty wild theories in lore about how different independent races actually use the elder gods and the outer gods. But we can get into that when we get to the lore section.
So the casting of spells is like, this is to me kind of a weird alien part of the game. But when band of investigators or a party of players for the first time actually pull something off, it's kind of a big deal. It changes, like Darren was saying, it does change the playing field. And you can even summon servants, some of the servitor races that serve the old ones and stuff. You can summon them, but there is a requirement to bind them to you as well. So there's a process by which you would summon some otherworldly thing or creature, but then you have to bind it to your will, or you have just summoned a monster that's probably as dangerous to you as it is to anyone else.
It's definitely a gamble.
Yeah. And that tension, again, plays to the fun of magic, where it's like damaging you to take it on, but without it, you likely won't be able to really as far as you need to in these longer form campaigns where you're standing up to the big bads.
One thing that I don't like is it just takes too long to study these books. Some of these books, it's like 20.
Yes.
I'm like, when are my players going to get to study this book? They're going to be on a ship for like maybe 10 days.
Yeah, I don't fully understand the considerations. I agree. Yeah, it's like, because there's downtime, and that's accounted for in a lot of campaign-based role-playing games, especially with bigger adventures like Masks of Nyarlathotep, where there's a lot of travel involved. But
even then, there's 30 weeks of travel.
Yeah, we're talking about like basically the beginnings of the modern era of like world travel, where it's like, yeah, you know what? It doesn't take that long, actually.
Yeah, you're on a ship for 10, 14 days maybe. So
yeah, and you're like, oh, I just got into this book. It's like, I'm only past the introduction.
Exactly. There's some interesting house rules that I found on Reddit, the way people handle that, and my thing is you give it an initial pass, and an initial pass is assuming you speak the language of the book. An initial pass will give you the information of like, does the book contain a spell? Is it worth the full study?
Oh, okay.
Right. And then maybe if you do like a meaningful fraction of the full study time, you get one of the spells that are in the book. So you can kind of start making some headway. But to me, it makes no sense to make a character. It encourages metagaming.
Yeah, it does.
Which I would rather just give my players a couple of spells nice and quick, and then they can get into the actual role playing and the investigating instead of trying to metagame a way to study a book.
Yeah, right. My favorite aspect of the spellcasting is that it is also alchemical as in nature too, where you can make concoctions and potions that kind of go beyond like a healing potion, you know. My favorite for this game is Space Mead, which like I don't even have a clue why that's the name for this, but it is what facilitates your characters performing interplanetary travel, because you can drink this concoction, you go catatonic, and then a mythos creature like a giant bird of prey carries you through space and time to a new location. And because you're intoxicated on Space Mead, it doesn't destroy you both physically or mentally.
So specifically, I believe it summons a Bayaki, which is a creature that can fly through space. There's several races in the mythos that can exist, not only propel themselves through space independently, but can survive the vacuum of it as well. The Bayaki and the Migo probably are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, it gets a little psychedelic, some of the mythos.
It gets pretty tripped out, yeah. But yeah, Space Mead basically gives you the same properties as those creatures, and then I think like a Bayaki picks you up and flies off with you.
Which is just grand. Love it.
Yeah, we won't get into like really bonkers stuff like the Dreamlands. That's a whole other terrifying ball of wax that I don't want to get into.
Yeah, the Dreamlands are gnarly. I also love the Migo. The Migo are super cool.
Oh, the Migo are amazing. And one of my favorite Lovecraft stories is damn it, now I've forgotten the name of it.
I know, I'm like it's on the tip of my brain here.
It's the Migo story. Yeah.
I'm running a campaign right now that is basically a sequel to that story.
Oh, that's awesome.
A time to harvest.
The whole encounter around the cabin, and like the Migo are basically treated as like terrifying monsters that you can barely see out of the corner of your eye, and then later on it's just like, oh yeah, straight up talking to him.
Whisper in the darkness. That's it. Yeah.
That's it. Yes. Love that story. One of my favorites.
That would kind of be the high level of magic. I mean, the main thing about it is, in my experience as a Call of Cthulhu player, not a keeper, is that you don't really engage with it in most of your play, because you don't get there until your equivalent depth in a campaign is pretty great, or you're at a high level of play. Because most one-shots or short adventures, it's mostly you using like a 12-gauge shotgun as opposed to, any magic.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
You're probably...
And the 12-gauge shotgun doesn't necessarily work. The one shot I played with Darren, I basically like point blanked the bad guy, and he may have flinched.
Yeah, you did a decent chunk, but he's a bit of a beefy guy.
Yeah, so it just goes to show that like even the guns aren't a guarantee.
Like a regular cultist, a gun will do the job for sure.
I mean, they're basically like you, so if you get a decent shot, they're done. So yeah, then we get into how the game is played, essentially. So there's a pretty extensive keeper description chapter. So we can get into how the game is played, and there are notes that basically a keeper chapter about how you run the game, and these seem fairly unchanged, and it's honestly good advice generally, especially for the era that it was made, in the way that you're not against the players, but you do want to run the bad guys as if they are trying to stop their characters. And there's a very good, I don't know if I want to go as to use like the political theories of like friend-enemy distinction, but there is something like that being described as to being like, okay, look, you want the story to go forward, but you don't want to like make that undramatic.
Yeah, you don't want to coddle them.
Yeah, because it is a horror game. And horror is ostensibly, weakness is what characterizes it. So making them feel under threat is what makes the game fun.
And I think also thematically, the well-being of the players, like the well-being of their investigators, is directly tied into the themes and the narrative, where in something like Dungeons and Dragons, it's not. Like, so characters failing, but still kind of like getting finish line, despite the cost to body and mind, is like the core of the game. So if you're running a game and everyone like solves the mystery and kills the cultists and shuts down the ritual and everyone walks out unscathed, this is why you playing Call of Cthulhu. Just go play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, you must have not done it right. Yeah, if the best, I honestly think that in any time I've run Call of Cthulhu, the best outcome is when the ending is an absolute blowout.
Yeah.
Where the players take every trick that they have learned or cultivated, and like even games I've played, it's a Mass and Nyarlathotep reference, so I'm not going to make it because I know Troy is currently in your game.
Yeah, we're coming to the close of our English chapter.
I'll just say that in order to stop something at the end of the campaign, my character valiantly exploded himself.
That's
heroic. You've played the entire campaign?
I've played it in sections, yes.
Okay, nice. Yeah, it's quite something. It's something else.
I played it more as a series of one-shots than as a complete, which is weird because it was like amended. But yeah, I've experienced some of the highlight moments of that campaign. So, and I've read it too. You
should check out the radio drama.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Their dark mystery radio theater. I don't know. It's from the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, and they do a bunch of radio dramas, and they do a Mask of Nyarlathotep. It's like 7 hours. It's really good. That's
amazing. Okay, I will definitely check that out.
Troy, do not check this out. Do not go and listen to it. Stay away.
Yeah.
When we're done, go and listen to it because it's great.
Yeah, stay away.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a terrible amount of work, but it's great.
Darren has invested enough in you not knowing. We can talk about how that level of investment is like. I don't know. Like, you can really get into Dungeons and Dragons. You know, it's like, oh, I'll make character art of my guys, or I'll like commission that. Some people get more into it. But I feel like Call of Cthulhu really demands a certain level of theatricality that pays off. You could explain, Darren, what you've done. And
well, one of the things I love about running games in general is I'm like a huge theater nerd. I was into acting and all that kind of stuff. So I love really playing up the NPCs and coming up with different voices and accents for everybody. And there's just an insane cast of NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, it's like almost 200 like NPCs. So to flesh all those out as individual unique voices is like 30% of my prep.
Right.
Whereas like that would never be a thing in a D&D campaign. I don't know, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, in a D&D campaign, you're just like a variation of a British guy accent.
Yeah.
For every NPC.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also like, we were talking about handouts earlier. Handouts are part of the game. Brings like the tactility that a good handout brings.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and bought the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society prop set. They're like film prop level quality handouts. It's amazing.
The one folder I was given that was like 38 pages was so interesting because I didn't need all of it. But by going through it, it just added this context and, I hate the word, but immersion,
right? Exactly. No, I know what he's talking about, Max, is it's a complete like psychiatrist and of Jackson Elias. It's just like 30 pages, and it comes in a folder that's like sealed with a do not tamper seal for its like medical records.
Oh wow,
it's great. It's the real deal,
and it details all of his dreams that he's having and all this stuff. And it's like 30 pages of information, and it's like, here's a handout.
Yeah, this like full dossier.
Yeah, running Call of Cthulhu game is quite a bit different than running a.
Well, and there's been something that I've always had a hard time with is figuring out, like, how would you do a custom adventure? Or, you know what I mean? Like, how would you write your own? And this book gives you, like, a splash of that. You know what I mean? A splash of support for writing a custom adventure, if you want to call it that. But that's always been one thing I found with, like, Call of Cthulhu or these more investigative games is, how do you as a game master or a keeper in this instance come up with that on your own?
Like now you can go online and you can buy these, like from the HP Lovecraft Society, you can buy all these like font packs and all these like ways to format and create like 1920s themed newspaper cutouts and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
And you could buy all these like cool like digital things you just print out. But like, how are you going to make a newspaper cutout, like a newspaper clipping in 1981?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You got your own like mimeograph machine maybe, but
just to quickly digress into my prop set that I bought, like the newspaper clippings are printed on old fashioned newsprint using like one of the only vintage like Cthulhu era like print presses that are still like in operation in the States. So it's like you're getting a legit vintage newspaper clipping.
Oh yeah,
that's wild.
I've like handled these things and they're like, oof. That's good.
Yeah. They're cool.
I guess we can kind of get into how like money and income kind of play out in the sort of long term.
They come up a lot because this is a real world, or it's based on a real world. So you need to be able to afford travel, supplies, all these things, and they come up in a more natural way than like your typical, I guess I'll go to the general store, buy all the gear I need for a 3-day journey, and then we'll go to the dungeon. It's like you kind of need money to grease the wheels continually. You know what I mean? And some adventures will give you like a patron to help you with your income.
Yeah.
In other cases, it's based on your character's profession, right? Like what is their job and extrapolated income from that.
Yeah, which is based off your credit rating.
Yeah, the credit rating is kind of like a consolidation of that idea.
Yeah, the profession dictates your credit rating. Credit rating skill dictates your basic ability to spend money and the value of your assets.
Yeah, it does save on coin counting a lot of the time, which is nice, especially coming from D&D where, well, that's like a survival game, so there is some utility in that. But in a game where you're primarily trying to investigate things, it's a bit of a pain to have to track your wealth in a dollar-to-dollar level.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I don't know, does second edition have cash? Or is it all just...
It's all credit rating.
It's all credit rating, okay.
It's all credit rating. Yeah, it's all done based on like... It's abstracted, essentially. Yeah. So like the money in your pocket is that same number. Yeah.
Okay.
They don't implement the tiers. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I guess 7th edition kind of starts to bring it into a little bit less of an abstracted thing. Your credit rating determines your spending level, which is a completely abstracted thing. Was it like how much you could spend like every couple days?
Yeah, I think 6th edition kind of starts splitting the difference, but you're right, 7 goes all the way with that.
And then you have your cash, but your catic value and doesn't replenish quickly. So once you're like your spending level, you can just keep using basically. But if you go into your cash goes down. If you run out of cash, you have to start selling your assets.
Yeah.
Which would come into importance in like a really big campaign. Like, I gotta book passage to Egypt. I'm going to sell my car.
More of those long form considerations.
Yeah, and I think that in my opinion, mechanics are only as good as they add drama and tension to the story. So
Yeah.
Money can do that, honestly, as you say. Like maybe I got to flip my house and get a second mortgage so I can go investigate the terrors of the unknown.
Delta Green would be the opposite.
I know, yeah.
Be like, oh, my wife left me because I'm always working and I lost my house.
Yeah.
My assets are cut in half. Paying alimony.
Yeah,
I can't
right.
afford my psychiatrist anymore because I got to pay my wife alimony.
Yeah, Delta Green gets a little too real.
Yeah, it does. It's grim. It's a grim one.
A nice thing about this one is, so we get down to the appendices and scenarios, which is most of what the appendices are. And it's quite generous. It's got 3, scenarios, example scenarios.
One-shots.
One-shots, yeah. And they are pretty bare bones. So they have the haunted house, which will be later titled The Haunting in later editions, and is kind of the staple of examples.
Yeah.
Darren and I were talking about this before, but we don't necessarily feel that it's like the best introduction, but it does make a point if you want to read through it.
I think it's a really good scenario for people who have probably maybe never played any kind of RPG.
Sure, yeah. I'd agree with that.
It very much holds the player's hand. It has a section where you could just straight up, after the intro, you just straight up tell the players, oh, you could do this, you could do that, you could go to the library, you could go to the newspaper and look up, old articles. You kind of guide them through it, and then once you get to the climax, then the actual game kind of starts to reveal itself.
Yeah, it only feels really Call of Cthulhu-y toward like the last third.
When they get to the house, weird stuff starts happening.
Yeah, once you're actually in the house, yeah.
And
Don't go to the basement.
Even then, it sort of plays out more like a traditional horror. Like you're at a haunted house. It's not really, you're not really playing with the cosmic horror themes.
Not until you get to like the basement very end part, and only just very much at the end there.
Yeah, the very, very end. There's a part in the adventure where you get an investigator can potentially get thrown out of a window, Exorcist style.
Yep.
Which is, like it's cool and it's an interesting set piece, but it's not really like a Lovecraft thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it feels more like something that you would... Honestly, I feel if you elaborated it a bit more, it would work better in the horror game Chill.
Yes.
Which is a bit more of that sort of, I won't call it campy, but more of that traditional ghost story type horror.
Yeah.
Whereas Cthulhu, it feels a bit sort of slapped together.
Yeah, it does the job. I think now, if I'm correct on this, the haunting doesn't come in the rule book anymore. It's a part of the quick start rules, which are free on the Chaosium website.
Which is probably a better way to do it.
Yeah, and then there's the Crimson Letters, which is an awesome scenario in the 7th edition rule book. And then there's another one, I can't remember what it's called. But they're more of a classic, more of a real scenario.
Yeah, it kind of digs into the theme a bit more. So yeah, the other scenarios are the Madman and the Brockford House. I don't know if these have been readapted, but they are similar. I think the Madman... Oh, there is an adaptation of the Madman in 6th edition, but I've forgotten what it's called. It has something to do with a jazz trumpeter. Damn, no, that slipped my brain.
Oh, there's one in the 7th. There's a 7th edition one. And it has to do with Miles Davis, and there's like a trumpet.
Yeah. I think the Madman is kind of a primitive version of that.
Okay.
And then the Rock, I was sick this week, so I didn't get around to the last scenario.
I think Brockford House is the one that has the big cavern underneath it. Spoiler alert.
Oh, yes. The Cave Network. Yeah. Sorry for spoiling a game that's this old.
That kind of sounds like Rats in the Wall.
Yeah.
Rats in the Wall. That's my favorite Lovecraft story. I love the ending of that. The ending of that is like...
Yeah, definitely the temple under the house kind of thing. Yeah.
That gets it.
The ending of that story is the perfect example of like how it doesn't make sense that he was then able to coherently tell his story.
Oh, yeah. No, it's...
Like the way he ends up in the story, it's like, how is this the same person retelling the story? Like...
Yes.
Not to give it away, but it's kind of like... And then I died.
Basically, like, then he...
Wait, what?
And then my sanity reached 0 and my character was lost.
Yeah. and I don't know how I got out of there.
But here I am
I
telling
am.
you the story, and it's like,
The theme of cosmic horror, though, right? Like the recounting we were talking about.
yeah, like yeah, I know for sure. I think I've always kind of like my headcanon is always like he's not telling anybody the story. He's like this is like an inner monologue in his insane brain.
Yes.
Okay, and now we can get, speaking of cosmic horror, we can get into the bulk of the lore of the Lovecraftian universe, or the Cthulhu mythos. This is sort of more properly referred to in this. Yeah, where to start with this? Okay, so as I had mentioned before, there's a framing that these are alien entities, possibly interdimensional. In some cases, well, when I get around to getting into some of the bigger players in this, that concept may get even more strange. But briefly, cosmic horror is essentially a horror of knowledge of the greater universe, I guess is the best way I could put it. The idea that whatever we know or understand in our everyday lives is kind of pales in a kind of comparison to the actual reality beyond the shores of Earth. And, well, even within Earth, there are places you just don't understand things.
And you don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, and if you could, you'd probably regret it. And that is a common theme where basically people go too deep and can't come back. And this theming of supernatural terror is more or less codified in game form here, but it inspires things like even like the chaos gods of Warhammer draw a lot from this. It's a bit more mythologized in that case. In this, the best way to handle cosmic horror is to not talk about it and kind of just let it happen. I find it has the most effect. The more you actually know, the less kind of sting it's got.
Yeah, for sure.
There is I guess there's a pantheon of sorts, which is a bit strange. I don't know whose decision it was to stat gods.
I don't like static gods. I think that's a ridiculous concept.
I think you could stat a great old one, maybe.
Even then,
That still seems stupid because it kind of takes the mickey out of it.
well, even then, unless you have a steamboat, you're not going up against.
No.
It's the same thing to me if you have like a licensed RPG and you were to stat Darth Vader. All anyone's ever going to try and do is figure out how to kill that guy. And that's the same thing it does to statting a god, you know?
You cannot kill Cthulhu. It's like never gonna happen.
It invites a notion you should not be entertaining.
Exactly.
It's kind of impressive. They're impressive stats, though. And they're kind of fun to read and go, oh, wow, yeah, you could never kill that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess for principle of scale, it might help to give you like, oh yeah, here's a numerical explanation for why you aren't going to succeed.
I think the only stat that's relevant to any real game is the sanity damage stat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like if you see Azathoth, like you're taking a 1d100.
Here's a question. Can you see Azathoth considering scale and all these other factors?
I think you can like come into contact with him.
Yeah.
There's a one shot where the players at the end of the scenario are walking down a hallway and there's a couple doors. And one of the doors, there's like a gateway that is being formed.
Mm.
And if you open the door, you're like looking into outer space at Azathoth, like the swirling chaos.
That's a bad day.
Yeah. So I think, but yeah, it's the sanity damage stat's probably the only thing you actually need to stat out in terms of as far as the game's concerned.
Yeah. So speaking of Azathoth, we can start there. So on the top of the pyramid of weird, we have the outer gods, which are a category unto themselves, but also contain two other categories. And this book categorizes them differently than other books for some peculiar reason. I guess it's just not as established as to like how these work. I know that a lot of these categories actually weren't made by Lovecraft. They were probably made by Robert Bloch because he did more mythos stories. He's probably more famous for the novel Psycho.
Oh, okay.
Robert Bloch kind of follows after. And to be fair, yeah, that's actually a good point that W. Chambers wrote The King in Yellow, and then that inspired Lovecraft to then turn that character into anyway.
Yeah, it's a weird, like, little MCU.
A little meme magic happening in this. So yeah, you have your outer gods, and the two noted in this book are Azathoth, as we said, who is basically, I guess you could characterize him as a god of destruction. I've sometimes seen it described as the black hole at the center of the Big Bang.
Yeah, there's almost like an interpretation of Azathoth being the thing, the chaos that birthed what we know as the universe.
Yeah, and that it resides somewhere in the middle of that, and it sometimes is described like a black hole, also sometimes described as a bit of a just sort of a destructive nebula-looking thing.
Yeah, this is a vortex of chaos and insanity, a circle of like trumpeteers, like forever playing weird abstract music.
Keeping it sleeping.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's playing abstract jazz to keep it asleep.
Super weird. And that's the thing. It's like, how do you describe these things? They're so hard. Like, you can't fully describe it because that's what makes them so horrifying, because you can't even fully comprehend it. So how do you describe something you can't even like truly comprehend?
Yeah, totally. And then the other one mentioned is one of my personal favorites, which is Yog-Sothoth.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that it's ever well described what Yog-Sothoth is, but once you get your head around it after you've read enough like things, you realize that it's like Yog-Sothoth is a living portal network. I think whoever was doing the Warhammer 40,000 mythos grokked this and turned it into the webway.
Oh, okay.
But in mythos terms, it's alive and it thinks, and it's basically the god of space and time, and the defiance of that as well.
Yeah, things get weird and abstract,
but whenever it's represented, it's sort of represented as a bunch of portals, sometimes as bubbles that are like connected to each other in weird ways.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to get into weird theories, I think that the great race of Yith actually have some kind of connection to Yog-Sothoth. And I think if you understand those entities, you'll know what I'm talking about. You know, they can project their consciousness through time.
Okay, yeah.
They can body swap.
Oh, that's intense.
Yeah, so, well, we can get into the creation myth after we cover these. So these are two big players. There are some sort of lesser ones like Shub-Niggurath, which is the mother of...
Shub-Niggurath is one of my favorites.
Yeah, everyone loves Shub-Niggurath, mostly because of the kinds of cults you can come up with. She's a lot more personable, but essentially like a sort of perverted life god.
Yeah.
So all the terrible horrors kind of spring. And I think anytime that she's directly described, it's kind of like a big flesh nebula.
It's like a giant like ball of like black fur and like hooves.
Whoa.
Yeah. And the size is a little indeterminate, but it's big.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it's big.
And then little bits of it kind of pop off, and those become usually dark young, but they can turn into sometimes other terrible things. And Dark Young have an interesting, certainly in scenarios, there's some pretty wacky things that I've seen written about how Dark Young are used.
Even statting out a Dark Young is almost like redundant. Unless you're super deep into a campaign, you got some really powerful magic, like the only thing to do is just run away. Just run, and even then you're probably going to half a party.
Yeah, it's almost
Yeah,
meaningless.
that's right.
Yeah. Hope it doesn't chase you. Yeah, and then there's a whole plethora of other gods. There is one subset of these gods called the Elder Gods, and only, at least in this book, only one of them is names, which is Nodens. The only thing we know about this subset is that they oppose the other ones, and we not necessarily in a way that they're on our side. They just don't jive with the other outer gods.
Yeah. It's a bit of a yin yang kind of thing.
Yeah, and the concept of the elder sign comes from this, which is maybe one of the only protective symbols that exist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the elder gods are where basically you're tapping into their power in order to invoke the elder sign.
And an interesting thing about all of these entities is that there seems to be a family tree at work. Like a lot of them are related, a lot of them are like offspring of other ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's nepotism at the cosmic scale.
Yeah, exactly. When we get down to the great old ones, which I guess are this world's equivalent of demigods, maybe the closest.
Yeah.
So they're not as vast, but they are definitely so powerful. There's no point in like.
Yeah, they're less abstract too.
Yeah. So this includes Cthulhu for sure.
Star of the show.
The titular villain. Which I think it's funny because it's called Call of Cthulhu, and like, where's the Cthulhu campaign?
Oh, I know. I mean, that's always been a bit of a weird one.
I think it's so strange that there's not like a proper Masks equivalent campaign where you're like Cthulhu plans. It's just kind of bonkers to me.
No, totally. Not to mention that, like, in almost every edition of the lore, they talk about how the Cthulhu cult is the most prolific of cults, and yet, where's the campaign?
Yeah, it's strange. So there's like a couple one shots that I've come across where you're dealing with Cthulhu cultists and like Cthulhu idols, but the campaign centered around stopping like the machinations and strategizing and planning of Cthulhu. That's what I want.
Yeah, and I mean, you can use Star Spawn. They're fun.
Maybe 8th edition. We'll get one.
Maybe. Hey, maybe that's something we can take up when we have some time. I want a solid Cthulhu campaign. Yeah, okay, so we have the Great Old Ones. There's some debate, like when I looked at the list of what they had as Great Old Ones and what they considered major entities, I'm like, oh, that list has changed. Like, for instance, Dagon, supposed to be a Great Old One, but is not listed here as such. They basically just say he's a giant deep one.
Yeah, he's like a big creature.
Yeah, but they've improved his status over time. I think they kind of go back and forth on this. It's like, is Dagon just like a giant fish man, or is he actually got like some kind of cosmic connection? And Hydra as well, which is just the female equivalent of Dagon.
I always kind of imagined him as sort of halfway between like Cthulhu and a Dark Young.
He's definitely not Cthulhu level, but I think he deserves more respect.
Yeah, I don't think there's any chance a player, like a party, could maybe kill a Dark Young with like some magic and a bit of luck on the rolls, but there's no way they would be able to fight Dagon.
Some people have argued whether you can invoke the power of a thing determines whether it is a god or a Great Old One. And I don't know, like I'd have to read through Return to Innsmouth and to see if, because I know there's magic in that, but I don't know if it's actually invoked from Dagon. So maybe that's a
great story though, Dagon. It's a solid story.
Oh yeah. Dagon that's the first notable. It's not even that long.
No,
it's solid.
It's a solid intro to Cthulhu or to Lovecraft.
Awesome hook. And then we have our independent and servitor races, and these include a whole plethora of aliens. We can kind of get into I'll briefly touch on the origins of life on Earth. So there are these tall pumpkin-looking winged things called elder things, and they colonized Earth. And in the process of, I think sometimes it's referred to in the process as making Shoggoths, they accidentally make life. And it's so funny to think of like Shoggoths as these sort of like amorphous, terrifying like blobs of like shifting eyes and mouths, but that the way the elder things use them are basically like big fleshy tractors. Like they've used them to build their cities.
That's almost like Geiger-esque.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I was like, that's different. Okay. I mean, sure, a giant, almost infinitely strong blob of flesh would probably be pretty good at building things. Certainly get into all the tight spots. So they build a civilization in Antarctica, and in Australia, there's some like weird cone-shaped creatures. And then those get possessed by not a collective consciousness, just a consciousness from the future.
And that's the Yith.
That's the great race of Yith. And they set up a parallel civilization until they are then invaded by the flying polyps from space, in which they teleport their consciousness back into the future, where they are now a conscious swarm of insects. This is just giving you a taste of how crazy this fiction is.
Yeah, I always find it kind of counterintuitive that for a genre that is so dependent on like the unknowable and like the fact that things are incomprehensible to the humans, that they go through like so much detail and like creating how everything is connected and all these like crazy,
I know,
you know what I mean? It's almost like counter the main theme of it being unknowable.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's scarier that we wouldn't know these things and wouldn't understand these things. But then people have felt the need to codify it.
Yeah, it's cool that you can draw threads from that as a keeper, but it also kind of spoils it. You're right. It's like, it's just like that. Okay. Neat. Let's see what else we got. We've got serpent men, which are absolutely borrowed from R.E. Howard's Conan. and Howard and Lovecraft were correspondents, and so you see a lot of a crossover there. And the Snake Men have connections to, I think it's a great old one, the Yig, which is basically a bigger, more godlike Snake Man. And yeah, there's so many. I was so weirded out by like some of the categorization of these things. Like, as I said, Dagon and Hydra are not great old ones, but the Dole are. I'm like, interdimensional tube worms outrank giant fish man. Okay. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but we want to close things up. So, in conclusion, the game is highly influential to a whole bunch of things. As we had mentioned when we had done our Warhammer Fantasy episode, a lot of the guys who were making that game were playing this and also RuneQuest. And so there was this amalgamation of taking those concepts and then making a mythology that kind of is inspired by that greater thing. And evidently we're down to 7th edition when it comes to Call of Cthulhu itself, as well as a whole bunch of things that have spun off it, including tons of different time periods. You've got Cthulhu by Gaslight, you've got Cthulhu Invictus, Cthulhu Dark Age, pretty much every theme that exists, including a pulp version, so you can have more of an action adventure. And yeah, I mean, the Cthulhu mythos has gone, its popularity has increased and decreased over time, but overall, it's always had an impact on fiction. So I think in conclusion, this is kind of the starting point to a lot of what comes into gaming more broadly. So that's it for this episode. Next episode, we will be talking about a sort of strange precursive game to Warhammer 40,000, which is the game Laserburn, a game that I think was originally developed before being brought to Games Workshop, but then was part of that process and then eventually gets us to Space Marines. Until then, have a great time playing your games and enjoying this wonderful hobby of ours, and you will see us or hear from us then.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. Big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.